church? Hell no. Are you no longer feeling comfortable in church? This podcast is for individuals who are desperately missing God, but don't know how to find Him. Substance abuse, domestic violence, sex offenses, acrimonious divorce can contribute to discomfort in the church. For these individuals, church is just not an option anymore. Ordained minister Dennis Hall and his guests invite you to listen to this podcast for topics that are inspiring, uplifting, and will bring hope to those who just feel church is not relevant in their lives today.
Hello, I'm Dr. Dennis Hall, and I am delighted that you have tuned into our podcast today. It seems like we always have a lot to talk about, based on what's going on in the news. And, the news continues to report on newly released information that portrays former President Obama as guiding and directing and colluding and conspiring with leaders of national intelligence and the FBI to undermine the newly elected President Trump. And it seems like the only thing that's being debated in the news today is whether Obama has any immunity from judicial prosecution as a result of his serving as former president. Now, I just ask you today, and as we think about this and talk about it, do you think status and greed has anything to do with elite politicians attempting to undermine a sitting president, President Trump? Elon Musk, while he was heading up the DOGE effort, the Department of Government Efficiency effort in the Trump administration, he even asked the question when he wrote this. He said, it's not like these politicians started companies or were NBA all-stars. So where did they get all this money? Does anyone know? You see, people have questions. Occasionally, members of Congress do engage in outright corruption. With the most recent example being Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey, who was accepting all kinds of gifts, including gold bars for political favors. This man is now in federal prison. But for the most part, politicians, they have the ability to leverage their status in ways that are not illegal. Yes. One of the prime ways that politicians can increase their income substantially while in office is through book sales. For instance, in 2022, Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts earned over $443,000 from book royalties. And then in 2023, 8 different senators made more than $100,000 from book agreements that include Democrats like Senator Raphael Warnock of Georgia and Tim Kaine of Virginia, along with some Republicans like Senator Ted Cruz of Texas and Senator John Hawley of Missouri. Book proceeds are by far the most common way for lawmakers to generate significant amounts of income while in office. Now, you don't have to think very long about how even these book deals can be corrupted. Becoming a landlord is another way for property-owning members of Congress to make money. A very legitimate practice. And many members of Congress have also added to their income by investing in stocks. Because members of Congress have non-public, you hear that, non-public inside information, and sometimes participate in decisions that can affect stock prices, some members of Congress, rightfully so, I think, have been accused of acting unethically. A target of public criticism has been former Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, who was able to increase her net worth in 2024 to $413 million from $370 million the year before. Some of her stock trades, by the way, all done in her husband's name, have certainly raised eyebrows. For instance, they dumped 5,000 shares of Microsoft stock worth an estimated $2.2 million just a few months before the FTC announced an antitrust investigation into this tech giant. They also sold 2,000 shares of Visa stock worth an estimated $525,000 less than 3 months before the credit card company was hit with a Department of Justice monopoly lawsuit. She also invested $1.25 million in a California cybersecurity company the same week that the White House briefed lawmakers on a serious national security threat from Russia. All this formidable profit making comes in the midst of growing calls to ban Congress from trading individual stocks. Why can't we get that done? Americans have long been critical of politicians and skeptical of the entire federal government. According to Pew Research Center, 63% of Americans have little or no confidence at all in the future of the U.S. political system. 63%. And when survey respondents are asked to sum up their feelings about politics in one word or a phrase, only 2% used positive terms, while almost 80% use negative and critical words like divisive and corrupt. That's how they're viewed by the public here in America. And research shows us that more than 80% of Americans believe that members of Congress do not keep their personal financial interests separate from their work in Congress. The majority of Americans, 63% that is, say that 63% say that all or most politicians are motivated by selfish reasons and ran for office to make a lot of money. Wow. Given that perception of the public that politicians are driven to seek elected office to make a lot of money, I could not help but reflect on the wealth of the Obamas. Prior to being elected president, Obama had a net worth of less than $2 million. And during his presidency, his net worth increased to about $7 million. Today, since he left office, his net worth has increased substantially, with estimates that put it around $70 million. He earned $400,000 a year in salary as president. And today, he commands speaking engagement fees of $400,000 per event. He has a multi-layer agreement with Netflix to produce films and series. And Barack and Michelle Obama secured a joint book deal reportedly worth $65 million in 2017, just after he left office. Interesting. In 2005, they purchased a Chicago home for 1.65 million. And then in 2019, they acquired a 29-acre estate on Martha's Vineyard for $11.75 million. All this should raise eyebrows. What's going on here? It's clear to me that Obama leveraged his status as a former president in a way to accumulate significant wealth. Now, listen, other presidents have done the same thing. So he's not the only one. Other presidents have done the same thing. But, we must recognize that, greed can cause a person to undertake corrupt and unethical behaviors to protect their status and to not jeopardize their ability to amass even more wealth. Now, history has demonstrated that a capitalist society is more likely to produce a robust, growing economy and provide the freedoms that people enjoy. Now, despite this historical proof, more and more young people are willing to embrace socialist ideas. Yes. And perhaps a recent survey reporting that 78%, listen to this, 78% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. Perhaps this provides some answers. People who find themselves in these circumstances are not just lower and middle income individuals. Sometimes it includes higher income individuals. Living paycheck to paycheck means that if a person's income unexpectedly stops, they'd be unable to pay for basic necessities, that they'd have no savings available to get them through tough times. Now, this means they'd have no money available to pay for an unexpected medical emergency or a family crisis. According to the Forbes Advisors survey, more than 70% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck and have less than $2,000 in savings. When United States taxation policy comes up and there is a discussion about it, it's always argued that we should avoid overtaxing wealthy individuals because they reinvest their wealth into job-making ventures. And there's a lot of truth in that perspective. Compared to other nations, even the lowest income Americans have the benefit of, shelter and food, health and welfare benefits, internet and telephone communications, that in other countries is only experienced by high income earners. I got to tell you though, that's not going to prevent Americans from becoming angry if they feel that they're not on an even playing field with higher income members of our society. Let me ask you something. Have you ever heard the phrase, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer? The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. The parable of the talents found in Matthew 25, verses 24 to 30, it's perhaps the earliest written statement of this truth or aphorism. Verse 29 reads, For whoever has will be given more, and they will have abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. And because of this verse, the entire phenomenon of the rich getting rich and the poor getting poorer is often called the Matthew effect or the Matthew principle. Some attribute this truth to a 19th century poet by the name of Percy Shelley, who in a book he wrote was critical of the rich becoming richer and the poor becoming poorer. But whatever the source of this perspective, no one disputes the truth of the Matthew effect. This truth seems to be proven again and again right here in contemporary times. Since 2020, the world's 5 richest men have more than doubled their fortunes to more than $869 billion, while the world's poorest 5 million people have lost money. 4 of the 5 richest people in the world are Americans. Elon Musk, CEO of Tesla, saw his wealth surge to over $240 billion by the late 23, up 737% from March 2020. Jeff Bezos, founder of Amazon, saw his wealth jump 24% to over $167 billion. Larry Ellison, the founder of Oracle, big tech company, experienced a wealth increase of 107% to over $145 billion. And then the famous Warren Buffett, CEO of Berkshire Hathaway, saw his wealth rise 48% to over $119 billion. Now, let me just say at this point that I'm a strong believer in a capitalistic free society. And in our society, greed is an important factor in modern economics. Greed can be described with characteristics that are good, bad, and ugly. 18th century economist Adam Smith coined the principle of what's known as the invisible hand. The invisible hand. Meaning that individuals, while pursuing their own selfish interest and good, were led by an invisible hand that seemed to always turn out the best for society. And then, 20th century economist Paul Samuelson, somebody I studied while I was a young man studying economics, he popularized the use of this term to conclude that there are self-regulating systems that always tend to create economically optimal outcomes, which cannot be improved upon by governmental intervention. In other words, the selfish, greed-driven actions of individuals are beneficial to society. And for this reason, economists are among the biggest proponents of greed and argue that greed is beneficial for others in society. They argue that being greedy leads to the acquisition of wealth and that this wealth trickles down and spills over in benefits for society. And there are studies that have shown that greedy people sometimes perform better and work harder and earn more money. Other studies have shown that greedy individuals have a higher need for achievement and personal growth and self-enhancement and self-improvement. These are the good results from this thing we call greed. And then there are many empirical studies that see the bad side of greed. The bad side of greed is when greed results in hurting others. And there is clearly a link between greed and corruption, some of which I've already alluded to in this podcast. Many people are more dishonest, immoral, and unethical, and have no trouble justifying their corrupt behavior. And there's also been a number of studies that have found that the greediness The greediness of CEOs of a large number of companies had a negative impact on shareholders' return. And that greedy CEOs are less willing to invest in corporate responsibility, social responsibilities. The ugly part of greed is that it causes some to place their interests over others or society as a whole. It's interesting that studies reveal that greed is related to emotional instability, neuroticism, lower self-esteem, and less trust in others. Greedy people are just not happy, probably because they compare themselves frequently with others that are better off than they are. Back in the 60s, there was a rock and roll group known as the Kingsmen, and they recorded a very popular song called Money. And the lyrics went something like, this. The best things in life are free, but you can give them to the birds and bees. I want money. Yeah, lots of money. There's many things to cure your ills, but there's one thing that's going to pay your bills, and that's money. I remember hearing that song as a teenager. What is it about money that gets everyone's blood pumping? We all seem to be on an endless pursuit to accumulate wealth. And we can, some people even point to Ecclesiastes 10:19 that actually tells us money is the answer for everything. Well, let me just quickly add, you got to put that in the context of all the other teachings in the scripture. The answer to everything? Really? Does wealth and money really lead to true happiness or joy or fulfillment? Will it really solve all your problems? And what is money anyway? Well, it's the simplest, in its simplest form, it's just a way that we exchange economic value. And for that reason, it's actually a measure of our wealth. And I'm not going to, on this podcast, go through the whole history of money. One time here in America, our paper money was backed by gold, held in a vault in Fort Knox, Kentucky. Well, today, you need to know that our money is not backed by anything. Our money is not backed by anything, and that's true of almost every country in the world. Its only value is that it's legal tender. It's how we buy things. It's how we sell things. What gives today's paper money value is the credibility of the government that issues it. If society loses all faith in the government, our money has the potential to lose all value. So why are we constantly trying to amass money? Or should I say paper? Because that's all it is, paper. I mentioned earlier that money is a way to measure our personal wealth. So we have to ask the question, what's the real value in being wealthier than our neighbor? Are we in some kind of competition with one another? And if we are, what's the prize for winning? I once saw a bumper sticker that read, "The one who dies with the most toys wins." That's an interesting phrase, isn't it? The one who dies with the most toys wins. Yeah, really? Wins what? That's the question. Are we going to be driven by ambition or fueled by just incessant greed? Now, if you think about it, we're not actually in competition with anyone except ourselves. We all have unique gifts and talents. The real goal is to be the best version of yourself with the gifts and talents that you've been given. Yes, we call that ambition. Ambition is, this basic need to have positive change and live impactful lives, leaving an environment in better condition than when we arrived. We all struggle with this because the world literally worships the accumulation of wealth. In today's world, success is defined and measured by titles and status, material things, and wealth. And as a result, we begin to believe this deception and constantly chase after the worldly material desires, thinking that that will be evidence of our success. This is greed. This is greed. Ambition fueled by self-centered cravings. This deception is so beautifully fabricated that we can experience short periods of happiness after each material acquisition or attainment of a higher status. Have you ever had a chance to buy a new car? Boy, it's kind of a little bit of an emotional high of some kind when you drive off in your new car. But it doesn't take long for that to fade away. And when we stand back and view what we've acquired over a long period of time, we realize that that kind of happiness is short-lived. What I'm saying is, if your sole motivation is to acquire wealth and acquire material objects to increase your social status, I'm going to tell you that true happiness and content will continue to elude you, escape you, because these desires know no boundaries. You can never be fully satisfied. If this describes you or someone you know, or perhaps some elite political figure that you've been reading about, there will be a constant effort to compare yourself or their self to others, seeking validation. And it will begin to drive across all spectrums of your life. And it can become a thing that will allow you to embrace corruption. It will be a thing that can allow you to embrace corruption. Ecclesiastes 5:10 warns us, those who love money will never have enough. How meaningless to think that wealth brings true happiness. Greed can affect the individuals by blurring their vision between what is right and wrong. And slowly there's no longer black and white, but an endless field of gray. And then it begins to justify the means and makes illegal and unethical actions to acquire more to be seen as morally permissible. Morally permissible. These people who are struck by this kind of greed, they begin to see life as a zero-sum game, meaning that for someone to rise, someone else must fall. And I think it could be argued that these ideas are becoming more apparent in both private and public sectors, leaving everyone worse off. We're told in James 3:16, for wherever there is jealousy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and evil of every kind. James 3:16. Part of the problem is that secular society is teaching different values. What we're seeing in, music and movies and sports and politics and media and entertainment, it's influencing a life of selfish and ambition uh, in many individuals across our society. Have you ever wondered why publications like Forbes magazine rank billionaires and sports and movie stars by wealth? We get a list every year of who are the richest in these categories. And it seems the public is thirsty for this information about the opulent lifestyles of our favorite celebrities. It's no surprise that we all exhibit symptoms of greed. Yes, we're being bombarded by information about what greed can do for you. The scripture tells us, for when you love the world, you do not have the love of the Father in you. For the world offers only a craving for everything we see and pride in our achievements and possessions. These are not from the Father, but are from this world. 1 John 2:15 and 16. Greed, as explained in the Bible, is more than just an excessive desire for material wealth. It's a profound moral failure that disrupts the harmony between individuals in their community. The Bible often portrays greed as a form of idolatry, where the pursuit of wealth and possessions takes precedent over one's relationship with God and others. It actually leads individuals away from spiritual fulfillment and towards moral decay. The Hebrew term often translated as greed is betzim, which conveys a sense of unjust gain. The term is used where individuals are prioritizing their own gain at the expense of others. For instance, in the book of Proverbs, greed is frequently condemned as a path to ruin, contrasting the righteous who live with integrity and generosity. Then in the New Testament, the Greek word, pleonexia, is commonly used to describe greed. The term portrays an insatiable desire for more, often linked to selfishness and exploitation. The Apostle Paul in his letters repeatedly warns against pleonexia, pointing out that greed is incompatible with the life led by the Holy Spirit. Now, Jesus himself in the Sermon on the Mount warned, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moss and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourself treasures in heaven. The Apostle Paul also provided significant insight into the problems of greed when he wrote in his letter to Timothy, for the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Paul is illustrating that the pursuit of money can lead to ethical compromise and spiritual decline. Now as this podcast begins to wind down, and at this point you may be asking, well, what's wrong with the desire to achieve success? What's wrong with the desire to achieve success? I would say if it's a selfish desire for wealth and power and status, that it's a destructive form of greed. You see, ambition can be fulfilled, but greed cannot be satisfied. Ambition can motivate a person to work hard, but greed can motivate a person to avoid hard work and take shortcuts. Ambition, it will never encourage a person to act immoral, while greed can encourage a person to disturb and even destroy another person's life. A corrupt form of greed is part of the reason that a group of political elites conspired and colluded in an effort to undermine a sitting president of the United States. Thank you for listening to me today, and I hope you'll join us again in the future. May God bless you.